Good evening and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, December 15th. Concert is now just concluding, which was being put on by the Schiller Institute Chorus in the New York area. We may be able to get a report about that. I think it was also, well, of course, there were also people that saw it online. Perhaps we'll have some remarks about that a little later. What I'm going to do is start with something from Helga Sepp-LaRouche, which is from her webcast of today, in which Helga was organizing people and urging people to get themselves organized for the Saturday meeting, which we've called, which is, Peace on Earth or Humanity's Doom, the Case for Negotiations. So I have an excerpt from that webcast, which I'll simply read. So what happened recently, not quite unnoticed by the general public, is that the Biden administration reversed a long-standing policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. This, according to reliable sources, has left the opportunity or the option open to use nuclear weapons also against conventional attack or even under certain circumstances as a first strike. Now, this has to be seen in the context of Ukrainian incursions deep into the territory of Russia, 500 kilometers, and the general escalation of the situation. So this has led now to a response from Putin some days ago at a press conference in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, where he was basically announcing that this change in the U.S. nuclear posture is having the effects on Russia that they are also such that they are also reviewing their so far nuclear doctrine of only using nuclear weapons in the case of the territory in the state of Russia being under existential threat. And it's been retaliatory. They are now basically reviewing this with the idea of learning from the U.S. in terms of preserving their own interests only. Now, that remark has not, to my knowledge, been reported in any way according to the seriousness of the situation, namely that if you have two nuclear powers, each having about 6,000 nuclear warheads, with some 1,588 on the Russian side, combat ready for launch or warning any minute. You can assume a similar number on the Western side. That means we are in an extremely alarming situation, and there's been no coverage about it. What scares me about this, and I think that everybody should be scared, is the fact that you have this clear escalation and nobody of any standing is commenting about it. This is why the Schiller Institute has issued another call this time, basically to pick up on the offer of the Pope, which he made a little while ago, and which was now reiterated by the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, to offer the venue of the Vatican as a place for negotiation without conditions. Now, this is very important. There was also a conference in the Vatican 2 days ago with Cardinal Parolin, where he said we have to return to the spirit of Helsinki and inviting people urgently, because of the danger of nuclear war, to return to diplomacy. And I think that given the fact that the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church, which has more than 1 billion members internationally, and is respected by all Christians, but also the other religious leaders, and that you need a place, a person, an institution which can provide a framework to step back from this extremely suicidal and dangerous escalation. So I have issued a very short statement, and this will be linked under this video, and I urge you, as far as you can, through your social contacts, social lists, your contact list, social media, in any way you can, to ask people to join this mobilization. Because if there would be now many forces around the world supporting that, I think we could have an impact on the environment, because the Pope has made it very clear that he is equally open to Russia and to Ukraine. As a matter of fact, he made the extraordinary step to apologize for a derogatory statement he had made last week about certain ethnic groups fighting, especially cruelly. And he apologized. Now, I find this very, very important, that the Pope apologizes for something which he recognizes as having been wrong. And this was immediately praised by the spokeswoman of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova. And she said, for them, the incident is now over. Now, that is the spirit of the Peace of Westphalia, or Helsinki, if you want, because you have to draw a line and say, this is over. Because if you continuously escalate, then you end up in certain catastrophe. So I really urge you, join this campaign, circulate this statement, and ask people to send messages of support to the Vatican, to discuss it in the churches and other institutions where you are, and let's have a general mobilization to support this. Okay, now that's not the full thing. That's really excerpted from a much longer, well, not much longer, but somewhat longer statement that she made at the beginning of the webcast, which is now available. It's about 16 minutes long, so I would urge that everybody take a look at it because it will give you the orientation that we'd like you to have, or take it upon yourselves to have for the next 24-plus hours. Our conference will be on Saturday at 11 a.m. Speakers will include Helga Sepp-LaRouche, Garland Nixon, who is a journalist some people know from Sputnik News, Ray McGovern, and we'll have others. Diane Sayre will be with us as well. Harley Schlanger will be on. There will be other people. We're hoping to have one. Colonel Black, at least will have a video presentation, which, by the way, you can see now up on various of our sites, and we'd like that to be circulated. The purpose of us having made that was to help to build the conference. And there will be others that will be participating as in the questions and answers and in the discussion. All right, in terms of tonight, as people know, in the last few days, an announcement was made by various of, by the Biden administration and also by scientists at Lawrence Livermore Labs, which pertained to thermonuclear fusion, a particular experiment done in inertial confinement, which had an important and notable success. However, the problem is that since, in particular, the closing down, the forced closing down of the LaRouche Organization's Fusion Energy Foundation back in 1987, in I believe April of 1987, since that time, though it was true that our organization continued certain of its science work, the drive for thermonuclear fusion in the United States went off the rails. While people talk about private investment, while people talk about various other experimental programs, the actual drive to bring the United States into a kind of focus on science and technology as a driver of the United States economy was severely derailed with the incarceration of Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche had founded the Fusion Energy Foundation back in 1974. And by 1980, the Fusion Energy Foundation had successfully led a drive to create and have passed into national law in the United States a fusion energy crash program, fusion energy sort of Apollo production plan, which was done by Congressman Mike McCormick. It was written up by him, and it was signed into law by our then arch enemy, Jimmy Carter. Carter, who was president of the United States at the time, and he did have a nuclear engineering background. It's rather important in terms of the story in one sense, signed that bill into law, even though we certainly attacked Carter with as much vigor and venom as anyone we've ever attacked in politics. That got passed into law, but the crash program, the 20-year crash program, was never implemented, despite the fact that it was the law of the United States. And 40 years later, twice the amount of time which went by, the United States never committed the resources, and nor has it now. However, the fact of the experiment's success and the fact of the context, the unfortunate, tragic context of the war, and rumor of war, of global warfare that surrounds this, gives us both an opportunity to make something very clear about what the pathway forward is, but also to disabuse people and actually sort of set the record straight so that people really understand what it takes and would take to, in fact, create a condition in which peace on Earth would be powered by thermonuclear fusion. That can be done. It could have been done 40 years ago. In fact, it was done 40 years ago in two different instances, one in 1980 and another in 1983. But because of the actions that were taken against Lyndon LaRouche and his associates, we are required to discuss this in this context. And while it may be late, it isn't true that it can't be done. So Paul Gallagher played a role in actually both elements of this. And he was acting as the head of the Fusion Energy Foundation in 1983 as public spokesman, particularly of the Fusion Energy Foundation, March 23rd and after March 23rd, when President Ronald Reagan announced Lyndon LaRouche's policy, not as Lyndon LaRouche's policy, but as his policy for the SEI. And so we thought that tonight, whatever else we discuss, that the topic is basically nuclear power or nuclear war, and in that context, other questions can be discussed. Now, some people have wanted Paul to discuss some other things, and that's not unimportant. I brought up a part of that actually this morning to some of our organizers. And in the questions and answers, if we have time, we'll get to that. But we wanted to, given what Helga said, given the idea of the conference of Saturday, and given what the prospects are of what's actually at issue, as opposed to what the Biden administration is saying or others are saying about this issue of thermonuclear fusion, it'd be best to start from that standpoint, and then when we get to questions and answers, we'll do our best to accommodate what people think they wish to ask and need to know. So, Paul, if you're there, take it away.
Thanks. Okay, so this is an interesting development. There has been a fusion energy research result, which managed to break into not just the science press, but the popular press, at least over the and the general media over the last 48 hours or so, and even to a certain extent before the Biden administration organized their press conference on it a couple of days ago. Even before that, there were some reports on this as being a very important breakthrough in fusion R&D. So we need to look at that. I mean, first of all, the way Lyndon LaRouche always thought of space exploration and a crash program for fusion power was that they would lead the industrialization of the developing countries, the third world, the global south, that they would bring a laser industrial revolution to the advanced, deindustrializing advanced sector, which would spread into the developing sector. That space exploration technologies and a crash program for fusion power would transform education and the powers of labor in this country and internationally, that they would be open and collaborative, these crash programs, among nations, among the major nations engaged. There would be cooperation and collaboration, which would make, and a lack of classification and openness, which would make science and technology advance much more rapidly than they would otherwise, and enable the alleviation of poverty internationally as a result. That fusion development would expand the use of fission power worldwide because it would improve, the fusion research and development would improve fission power international, and its proliferation, which at that time was almost negligible outside a few major nations, and in fact has remained negligible throughout the developing sector since then. And finally, that this space exploration and crash programs for fusion, what Lynn ultimately expressed as the last of his four new laws to save the nation in 2014, that this would revolutionize the understanding of the atomic nucleus throughout the periodic table, the ordering of the structure of the nucleus and also the forces within it. And he worked with leading fusion scientists from the early 1970s on exactly these kinds of programs and these kinds of problems in order to get to fusion energy and to get to other plasma technologies as rapidly as possible. So that was the standard. In fact, it was the only way in which legislation like the McCormick legislation of 1981, as it was passed, the only way in which it could be realized and turned into an actual rapid development of the engineering of fusion power and the engineering of plasma technologies around the world. So let's look at the breakthrough at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories National Ignition Facility, which occurred on December 5th, and it was immediately reported internationally and then led to a press conference and technical panel of Livermore team leaders, which was held on December 13th, sponsored by the Department of Energy. The funding of this program, not Livermore National Laboratories as a whole, but this National Ignition Facility, is in the fiscal 23 budget of the Defense Department, and specifically in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal 23. The funding of this is $624 million. I want you to compare that to the public funding, the total public funding otherwise of fusion energy research and development in the United States. That in fiscal 22 was $117 million, over against which this one defense program, which made the fusion breakthrough on December 5th, for the next fiscal year will get $624 million in the NDAA. Private investment at this point in fusion research and development was in the most recent calendar year. This is not a fiscal year, but a calendar year, was $2.83 billion. So you're comparing $2.83 billion that various billionaires and millionaires are putting into private fusion experiments, which are more than classified. They are extremely proprietary in saying anything about their results and their designs. That $2.83 billion compared to $624 million going into this defense program and $117 million going into all other public funding of fusion research and development in the most recent fiscal year. This program, the National Ignition Facility at Livermore, is the purpose of it, the reason for its existence, is to validate the performance of nuclear warheads in U.S. stockpiles and on U.S. vehicles, to validate their performance without nuclear testing, since nuclear testing has been banned for many years under the Test Ban Treaty. That's where this program comes from. That's what it's for. And when the press conference was held on December 13th, all five speakers were either the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, or officials of the National Nuclear Security Agency under the Department of Energy, which is the agency responsible for the performance, the security and the performance of nuclear warheads. That's what it is. In the context of that press conference and also an interview the next day, Jennifer Granholm, the Energy Secretary, said this: the President has a decadal vision to get to a commercial fusion reactor within, obviously, 10 years, so we've got to get to work, unquote. Now, that was a nonsensical statement. $117 million in public funding for fusion is not any president's commitment to a decadal, that is, within the next 10 years, commercialization of fusion energy. And this is defense research. That is how all of the spokesmen for the laboratory itself, for the National Ignition Facility itself, that's how they explained it. It is defense research. In parts of it is classified research. And its purpose is, I think, was stated by one of the fellows there. He said, Alex Zylstra, the chief experimentalist of the ignition facility, quote, fusion ignition is a key process in nuclear weapons explosions. The fuel has to be compressed by a factor of 10,000. And he said, we are understanding nuclear explosions as well or better than we did when we had nuclear testing. So that's the purpose. Given that, it is extraordinary that what appears to have been the key design change. Now, I should just explain that this program has been in existence and has been conducting a certain kind of, the National Ignition Facility has been conducting a certain kind of fusion research, genuine fusion energy research, not development, but research, for many years. And over the past 2 years has suddenly gotten extraordinarily better results from its experiments than it was getting before. I'm going to speculate, this is not entirely just my speculation, I've also found it elsewhere, but it's still, I have no proof of it, but I'm going to speculate that what led to this sudden leap in the abilities of the NIF to come to fusion break even and go beyond it was, and let me just explain, this is the first in human history of fusion science, this is the first plasma created by human engineering which has ignited and burned in such a way that it produced more energy, more megajoules of power as output than it received as input from the lasers which ignited this tiny amount of fuel in a fuel pellet which the lasers were aimed at. So for the very first time in the global history of this research, the plasma went beyond break even and generated more power, more energy than was put into it. Meaning, of course, that if in some way, by some future design, it were possible for fuel pellets of the same kind to be packed, let's say, very tightly, or actually continuous with the one irradiated by the lasers, it is quite possible that a fusion burn would propagate through all of that fuel, and you would actually have the production of fusion power, not yet commercially, but nonetheless the demonstration of the production of fusion power. So in itself, in those terms, that was a very important result. As I was saying, the results of the National Ignition Facility experiments were revolutionized, it seems, in their advancing towards break-even and now beyond it, by a change which was introduced. Well, it was first discussed in a press release from the National Ignition Facility, November 26, 2019. So it's quite recent. They called it a strategic initiative that may lead closer to ignition, where more energy will be released by the fusion reactions than applied to the target. Physicist John Moody will lead a team which use a copper coil surrounding a hole round, the hole round being where the fuel is contained. I'm sorry, I didn't need to say that. It continues in the quote. Which will use a copper coil surrounding a hole round, a chamber containing the deuterium-tritium fuel capsule. As described in the release, NIF's 192 lasers hit the sides of the hole round, generating soft X-rays that heat and implode the capsule. When the implosion reaches its smallest size, the deuterium and tritium atoms in the hotspot fuse and release alpha particles, helium nuclei, neutrons, and electrons. The alpha particles deposit some of their energy in the surrounding cold fuel, stimulating additional fusion in a process called alpha heating. Moody explains that hotspot loses energy through electron conduction and radiation. If we can better contain the electrons and alpha particles' energy, this can lead to a self-sustaining burning plasma. By applying the strong magnetic field, the alpha particles are contained in the hotspot and electron cooling is reduced. That's the section from that release. And there was, on August 4th of this year, in Physical Review Letters, a scientific journal, the following from lead author John Moody, and he had co-authors on this paper. This was November 4th, so it was before the experiment of December 5th, which achieved this extraordinary breakthrough. And he said there, and this was written in August, published in November, the application of an external 26 Tesla axial magnetic field to a D2, that is deuterium gas-filled capsule, indirectly driven on the National Ignition Facility, is observed to increase the ion temperature by 40% and the neutron yield by a factor of 3.2 in a hotspot with areal density and temperature approaching what is required for fusion ignition. When he wrote that, the NIF was approaching, and it has since now breached and gone 50% beyond break-even. So what he was talking about here is essentially increasing the cross-section of the ions, of the separated positively and negatively charged ions, by 40%, and the neutron yield, which is a product of the reaction, by a great deal more. But that increase in the cross-section meaning that a lot more actual collisions resulting in fusion are occurring within that tiny bit of deuterium fuel. So this was done by the surrounding the laser implosion of the fuel with an electric coil producing a strong magnetic field. Since that process began, the results of the National Ignition Facility experiments have improved by 50 times. They had already improved by 25 times in the result that they announced about a year ago in August of 2021, which itself got a good deal of media coverage. And they then essentially made another 100% improvement in this December 5th experiment, so that they were producing 50% more. I'll give you the energetics of it. You have an array, an extraordinary array of 192 lasers, which are all directed through various forms of compensatory optics, which is a very complicated field and direct it on a single tiny pellet of fuel. They're also magnified by that process. They consume, now this is for a tiny nanosecond, they consume out of the wall, so to speak, the outlet, the plug in the outlet in the wall, they pull in this laser array pulls in 300 megajoules of power. It deposits on the little fuel pellet within that hole round, that's just the German word meaning empty space, empty room. They deposit on it in the form of electrons, in the form of X-rays, they deposit on it 2 megajoules. In this particular experiment, 2.05 megajoules. So 300 megajoules of power out of the wall, deposit 2 megajoules of power on the fuel hole round, and out of this came 3.15 megajoules of power from the fusion ignition and burn that resulted. So that's a 50% gain, and that's never happened before in any fusion experiment in the world. There was in the press conference some interesting comments on that. In particular, I'm trying to find the name of the fellow. I think his name is Marvin Adams. He's the National Nuclear Security Agency Deputy Director for Defense Programs. So again, that's who ran the technical panel where they were describing this great result. Adams said this plasma stayed hot enough, dense enough, long enough for the first time. That's very important. You have around the world fusion programs which have become more dynamic and have advanced beyond that of the United States in part for the clear reason that, as I indicated before, the funding outside of military weapons funding of fusion research, the funding outside of that has really become negligible and was never significant because the Magnetic Fusion Act that Mike McCormick put in and that we passed was never implemented. Funding for it was never authorized. So in those programs, people have heard and read in recent years about extraordinarily high temperatures that were reached up into the range of nearly 150 million degrees centigrade, well beyond the temperature of a plasma that's necessary for it to burn. China, Korea, one of the tokamak programs in Germany, all have achieved these kinds of results. Some of the private programs in the United States, privately funded programs, are approaching or have gone past 100 million degrees centigrade. That's extraordinary in itself. The length at which the plasma could be confined, even at such a high temperature, has stretched out to more than 2 minutes. And in one experiment in China, in the East Tokamak, really for 17 minutes. So again, what Adams was saying, this plasma stayed hot enough, dense enough, long enough for the first time. What's missing in those other experiments has been dense enough. The plasma does not have anywhere near the density as it's heated and expands, does not have anywhere near the density for many ions to collide with each other and fuse. So there's very little actual fusion going on there, despite the great heat for even that length of time. Density is what has been lacking. What you have here in the Livermore experiment is that for the first time that factor was there. Now, again, I speculate that the difference was made by the innovation of surrounding the laser imploded tiny bit of fuel by surrounding it with an electrical coil producing a strong magnetic field which kept dense that fuel plasma even as it began to heat up dramatically and want to expand very rapidly and therefore cool off. This magnetic field did not let it do so. So that's, I think, then it is extraordinary that in this entire press conference and technical panel, now you have 5 administrators from the Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Agency. Then you have a second panel of a director from the NNSA with 6 team leaders, scientists who are team leaders at the National Ignition Facility itself, the chief experimentalist, and so forth. In all of their remarks for an hour and 15 minutes roughly, nobody ever mentioned the innovation of the magnetic field. So I'll leave that at that. I believe they didn't mention it because to the purpose of this program, which is the improvement and maintenance of readiness and performance of our nuclear warheads for war, for the purpose of this program, that innovation is not that significant. That's my guess. It's also indicative, as was stated at this at the technical panel, that the lasers has not been, for many years, much of an improvement in the efficiency of the laser array. In fact, the laser technologies which are used in the National Ignition Facility are 1980s technologies. If this were a fusion development program, that would certainly not be the case in 2022. And Alex Zylstra, the chief experimentalist, said the laser wasn't designed to be efficient. He means the 192 laser array wasn't designed to be efficient. It evidently is not important to the objective of this experimentation. So you see what you're actually looking at here in the negative sense is that this is being driven and funded and driven by defense priorities, by military priorities directly related to the ability to fight nuclear war with major power adversaries. On the other hand, the array, the experimental design here with the 192 lasers and the tiny pellet, you're not going to see fusion plants around the world with arrays which are 2 or 3 football fields long of 192 lasers. This is not replicable. This is not going to become your commercialized fusion at any time. That's not the kind of design that is going to do it. But the interaction of magnetic confinement and inertial confinement, these, if you read about fusion, are the 2 different lines of development. Magnetic confinement, tokamaks, stellarators, Z-pinch machines, and so on. On the other hand, laser confinement, predominantly at the national laboratories. Those are the 2 lines of research and development. They don't meet. As long ago as 1976, in the Fusion magazine's Fusion Energy Foundation's publications, it was discussing, the FEF was discussing combined fusion, combined magnetic inertial fusion energy. That's what I believe you are seeing in a kind of purely experimental form here. But imagine that there is a crash program for fusion development of the kind which, believe it or not, the last national leader to call for this on November 9th of 2019 at the St. Petersburg Forum was Vladimir Putin, who called for a global crash program to develop fusion energy. Were that going on in the way that LaRouche formed the FEF to pursue, were that going on, this little experimental detail where a magnetic field was successfully combined with inertial confinement, this would be crucial. It would be cross-fired everywhere, not to make a pun on what happens in the fuel, but it would be cross-fired everywhere around the world. And you already have in many of the little fusion, privately funded fusion experiments that we know of, and also in China, and others, virtually all magnetic fusion experiments now are in one way or another using relativistic beams. They're either using lasers or particle beams to shape that magnetically confined plasma, to ignite it. They're effectively groping in the direction of a successful result with combined inertial and magnetic fusion. And I think this experiment at the National Ignition Facility would be a worldwide bombshell if the kind of fusion energy crash program that LaRouche intended the FEF for 50 years ago, if that were being carried out. So that's what I think is most important to understand about this. There's obviously many more technical matters which have been brought up by various writers, essentially as to the disqualification of this particular design at Livermore, the disqualification of this experimental design to lead directly to commercial fusion. In fact, some people have said this isn't really, the naysayers have said this isn't really break even because you had 300 megajoules consumed by the lasers and only 2 deposited on the target, and so the target produced more than 3. So that's not really, they say, more than break even. But I mean, that's really false. But what is the case is that a lot of neutrons, big neutron flux, is produced in this experiment at the same time. If this were in a prototype fusion device, the neutron flux would be destroying the walls of the device. So it's the principle of the thing. It's the crucial demonstration of a certain principle of interaction here between inertial and magnetic confinement fusion, I believe, which could ignite fusion development worldwide if this was not a military nuclear weapons program aimed at the proper performance of our nuclear weapons in war, which we are currently now and imminently threatened with.
Okay, what I'm going to do, Paul, is open up the queue so that questions can get in, and also reports. I actually want to ask you a couple of things, or just think we should maybe point a couple things out. Of course, the other point about a fusion experiment and what you're dealing with in fusion is what people have often referred to as the fourth state of matter. I think I'd like you to say something to people about that, because that's not, while some of us who were around when this was being, and of course when we were doing this as the FEF, know that. But we're talking about a form of qualitative transformation. You also mentioned the thing about the 300 megajoules. That's approximately the entirety, in fact, slightly more, about the entirety of the U.S. Electrical grid for the billionth of a second or so that's being that experiment is going on. But that's the equivalent in terms of the amount of energy that was being deployed. But it was being deployed in the service of something else, which was a form of transformation that had previously never been seen on Earth, or never accomplished on Earth. Which I think is also significant, because if you talk about the United States having less than an electric, which of course is what is happening, you're taking down the electrical capabilities, but it shows something about why this notion of energy density and energy flux density. If you would say just a few things about that. And again, press star 6 to get into the queue also. I guess I didn't say that, so just if anybody doesn't know that, people would do that. So But why don't you go ahead? I just wanted to get some of that clarification done.
Well, I mean, that's it's true. That's another thing that cynics and skeptics throw at laser fusion, that you're really using so much power to begin with that it's impossible to make it up. It's actually the duration of this is so tiny. It's not a nanosecond. It's less than a nanosecond in which these lasers are shooting. That the real consumption of electrical power is a great deal less than 300 megajoules, and you're dealing with a tiny fragment of time. As I indicated at the beginning, it would be a different matter if somehow in the future an array of fuel with a great deal of fuel in these pellets were able to be directly put in connection with, in propinquity with the ignited fuel, so that the fuel could ignite other pellets of fuel. That's just a speculation. Then the ratio would start to be very different. But I don't think that is the kind of design that will work. As Joel DeJean pointed out in discussion we had midday today, individual lasers with nearly that power are being developed and have been developed, what they call petawatt lasers with that amount of power. And they're tabletop devices. This is 1980s technology, as Zylstra acknowledged. It hasn't been important to the purpose of this program to advance it much, but always to work on the design of the fuel, the design of the hole round, the precision with which the lasers are on the fuel, the ability to isentropically compress it so that it compresses in a completely smooth way, that it's like every point on the balloon is being compressed at exactly the same rate at all times. All these things are what they work on. The laser array, they're pretty much working with one they've had for a long time. And this is potentially a much higher energy density process, and could become in a very short time a much higher energy density process than it is with all these lasers. This is a laser power efficiency that appears to be well below 1%, 0.6%, 2 over 300. But it could be a great deal more efficient than that, and the energy deposited on the fuel could be a great deal more efficient than that, especially when you have such very powerful lasers being used in combination with already magnetically confined plasmas, which is, I think, what you just began to get a glimpse of in this experiment. So, although this is not energy dense, this is 2 football fields consumed. That's like a solar power or a wind, a set of wind turbines. Well, they'd need a lot more than that. This is not energy dense technology yet, but it promises extraordinary energy density. And that is what Lynn always said was the mark, the characteristic of technological progress is the development and introduction through scientific innovation, the development and introduction of more energy dense technologies where that kind of concentration, where that amount of power which was deposited on that little pellet of fuel could be produced with a tabletop laser and not with a 2 football fields array of lasers. So that's the aim. I think that this is a very bright prospect for international collaboration and rapid progress in development of prototype fusion reactors. This kind of thing is in the immediate future of the new Chinese tokamak at Hefei, for example, which is intended to go into actual operation a little past the middle of this decade, 2026, but to go into operation as a fuel reprocessing device for nuclear reactors, for fission reactors, where you have such an intense burn of the fusion fuel, even though it's not breaking even, and it's not producing commercial power, such an intense energy-dense burn that you can very rapidly reprocess spent nuclear fuel into new nuclear fuel of various types. So they intend to get to that first, what has been called for a long time a hybrid fission fusion reactor, and to go on from that by about the end of this decade with a demonstration reactor immediately preparatory to commercial reactors. So that is actually the kind of decadal program as Jennifer Granholm was talking about, was talking nonsense about. That's actually the kind of decadal program which could work. It's aiming at improving the energy density of existing technologies at the same time as introducing a fundamentally new and higher energy density technology.